Okay.
Member Wood is here.
I have not heard from him. She's here. Yes. She has just stepped in, yes. All right. Next item is welcome and opening remarks. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this another meeting of the Joint Select Committee on Occupational Safety and Health. As we are well aware, the new parliamentary year has started, so we moved from 2018, 19, and we are now in 2020. I must say I'm satisfied that we are making good progress, and I know not too long from now, the work of this committee in respect of our clause-by-clause analysis should be complete. So I welcome you again, members, as we move to the next item.
The next item,
Yes.
Chairman, I just want to put on record my disappointment in listening to the Jones speech and not a single mention of this bill that we're making progress. So at least I'm glad it is a bipartisan disappointment.
Yes. Hansard has taken note, and certainly the powers that be do take note. So we move now to our clause-by-clause analysis of the bill. On the last occasion, we would have stopped at clause 114, which means that today we pick up on a new part, which is part part 7, beginning at clause 115. Further matrix has been circulated. I do not know if members you are able to review the contents of this new matrix, but we will be picking up and moving forward today with part 7. So members, you all have your matrix. Member Campbell and Cuthbert. Yes, may we have two, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. One more for member. Yes. So we are at the section of the bill now that deals with the power of labor officers, workplace entry by labor officers. So we will now proceed. AGC, I see on this matrix that you have the first comment.
Well, Chairman, I note from the matrix that the ministry is proposing to delete the clause. So,
Ministry, entire clause 115.
Yes, because we did not think it was necessary to define a relevant person conducting a business or undertaking and relevant worker in the first instance. Because it sets out who is a relevant PCBU and a relevant worker.
Any comment, members?
I had the same concerns, and I agree that we covered them already in the document.
So may we then have an agreement on this for clause 115 to be deleted. Agreed? Clause 116, AGC.
Chairman, our comment was really in relation to the marginal note, and the ministry has accepted the comment. So we don't have any substantive comments on 160.
Very well. Ministry?
Yes, we had shared the concern held by the Attorney General's chambers.
That's an observation, though. I see the term relevant worker used here. So, based on what we said in 115, to be consistent. B, 16B.
We have an amendment further on the next page on the MLSS, the same clause 116. Insert between the words may and enter the words at any reasonable time. Delete the words as an economic activity. So what we're saying is that the labor officer may enter a workplace or another place where domestic work is being carried out. Because under the Labor Officers Powers Act now, the labor officer has the power to enter a premises other than a dwelling house because there were concerns about them entering the private place of residence, so to speak. So we have maintained that in this legislation. Oh, and labor officers are officers authorized by the minister under the Labor Officers Powers Act to ensure compliance with labor laws generally. The laws have been highlighted in the schedule to the Labor Officers Powers Act. It includes, for example, Maternity Leave Act, Employment Termination and Redundancy Payment Act. It also included the Factories Act. So further on in this bill, you'll see where we will be changing the Factories Act to the Occupational Safety and Health Bill. So they will complement the work of the OSH officers.
Which chairman raised the issue
Yes.
for me. We're speaking here of labor officer. Is there going to be a different section for the OSH officer may enter in the way the labor officer may enter? And while we have in separate clauses for them,
Well,
have we resolved whether or not there are going to be a set of labor officers and there's going to be a set of OSH officers, separate and different, but able to carry out the same functions in part? And could I also ask, how does 116 fit into 118?
Minister?
what we're trying to do is to make use of the existing manpower that would be available. So you have the labor officers having a power of entry, but when we get to the sections dealing with the OSH officers, you'll realize that their mandate, that they have more powers than the labor officer. But the labor officers are already in the workplace trying to ensure that labor laws are being complied with. So we're trying to actually make use of that resource because they will probably be in the workplace even more than the OSH officer generally trying to administer the labor laws and to ensure compliance. So that is the reason why we're trying to utilize them also. So they do not, if you follow the sections when we get to the OSH officers, you'll see that they have more powers than a labor officer. But it will be that they will be complementing the work of the OSH officer.
Yeah, and that's what we had asked for policy decision to be taken on, whether or not we're going to have these two separate set of people, or we're going to decide that OSH labor officer or labor officer OSH. But I don't want to get into who have which power and who don't have which power doing the same thing. One set is OSH, one set is labor officers. So we need to resolve that. So we don't have when somebody comes to a workplace, so you use what? You use labor officer? Where does your power stop and or start? And oh, you're an OSH officer. You are to be treated differently. That's a little confusing for a business person. And do we really need to have two separate set of officers doing much of the same things?
Yes, Soldier.
In relation to the other issue about how does 118 fit in with 116, I read 116 to be subject to 118. Subject to in the sense that once you exercise that power, then everything that flows, all the other sections that follow will have to be complied with. The only thing I was a little concerned about, but I was still trying to reconcile it with some other provisions you have later on, is that normally when you allow for inspection, normally it is supposed to be during business hours, reasonable hours, unless there is some sort of emergency or an urgent need to be able to access the premises, and then you allow for that as well. And
business hours, just to clarify, if business is a 24-hour operation.
Right, so then sometimes we use the language of reasonable, during reasonable, I think it usually says, yes, there is older legislation that sort of contemplates the sort of 9 to 5 kind of business, which I realize would not necessarily work here because you may have the 24-hour cycle. But still indicating that, because you see, the thing is, even with your 24-hour cycle, you may not have that kind of senior supervisory management the way you may have that access during what is considered reasonable business hours. And remember that this is we're talking about a constitutional right, intrusion onto private premises. And so we weren't going to make much of it right here because there are some other provisions that come later on in the bill that also deal with entry and inspection. And we wanted to be able to make sure that I think they all have to be consistent. If we have two sets of persons that have these powers, the powers kind of need to be consistent. I don't see that we can justify one set of officers operating under one regime and another set of officers being able to do something else. But in terms of how 118 would apply, it would have to flow. It flows from 116. So once you have the power to enter, it then means that you would have to, as soon as reasonably practicable after entering, give this notice.
Chair.
Member Gill.
So 116, under the role in terms of specification is to ensure compliance with the Act. That's one. And to inquire. But when you look at the other areas of the legislation that is supposed to support this as a preface, you have in place suggestions around investigations and the likes. So you are suggesting that you want to utilize up the skill set of some persons who you already have in place who may, under the present jurisdiction, are overburdened. But that's another story. But we have to be clear in terms of what is going to be their scope of responsibility as opposed to the OSH officer. And anybody conducting business and any worker would want to also be clear in terms of the scope. So is it that, because I see when it come down to another area, it spoke about prevention, detection, investigation, and the likes. So I just want to be satisfied that the scope is only limited to ensuring compliance and inspection.
Mrs. Benny Campbell?
Yes, and when we do look at the powers of the OSH officer, you will realize that the OSH officer's powers are actually wider because their focus is just occupational safety and health. The labor officer is already having the labor laws, but they're in the workplaces enforcing the labor laws. And so if they have seen a contravention, they have a role to play. But what we're going to be trying to amend in terms of their role in relation to the provisional improvement notice that we discussed, because that is where they would address in terms of the contraventions, and then the OSH officer would come in after that stage. But the fact of the matter is we may not have the OSH officers to go into every workplace as often. Labor officers are in there already in relation to the other labor laws. So that is why we're trying, but the powers are not exactly the same when we compare them side to side, when we look at the OSH officers.
Again,
Yeah. And there's also a qualifications
Sorry.
point.
Again,
Yes,
Chair,
Honourable.
I ask the question. Who is senior in the civil service rank? The OSH officer or the labor officer? Are they the same? It's a policy decision that we need to resolve because it have implications for other things. But apart from that, you're saying to us the OSH officer can't investigate whether the worker who complain about vacation leave. No. That's what she's saying, and I want her to say it's not what she's saying. That the labor officer can talk to the worker about vacation leave payment or vacation leave granted. They can talk about whether your pay is minimum wage or not, because those are some of the labor laws that they would be able to enforce. And they could enforce the Factories Act, which would be what this will replace. So they would element all of this they will be able to deal with. So where does the OSH officer falls now, who is only dealing with this legislation only? Chairman, I don't know who is higher or lower or at the same level. And I'm just wondering whether or not we shouldn't be saying no. Well, OSH officers should be able to deal with minimum wage and all of that, and not be limited only to the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Because if we're rationalizing the public sector, so that's a big part of what we want to do. I can't understand where, if a labor officer come, he can deal with OSH problem. But if an OSH officer come, he can't deal with the other labor side. So again, I ask, can a policy decision be made relative to who, well, not whether anybody is primary, but that everybody have the same power and authority?
Mr. Mohan?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to point out that there's a difference between labor officers and OSH officers, because the entry-level requirements for an OSH officer is different from a labor officer. The OSH officer has to have, right now, a degree in natural sciences, pure and applied sciences, engineering, or a related discipline, while that for a labor officer is more in line with the social sciences. So it is a technical area that requires persons to have attained a certain level of educational or academic training that is commensurate to the requirements of executing the function as an OSH officer. There is a limitation, although the Factories Act is under the Labor Powers Officers Act, in that the Factory Act states that the Governor General, or in his absence of appointing a Chief Factory Inspector, it is the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Labor, and that the chief factory inspector is the person who appoints inspectors, and the appointment is based on the qualifications for the Administration of the Factories Act. So we have two different disciplines in the workplace. So administratively, it is the labor officers that are concerned with the labor laws, the maternity laws, as what Ms. Campbell has spoken to. But the Factories Act, which speaks to the safety and health in industrial establishments, it is really the inspectors who are from a scientific background who are charged with that responsibility based on their appointment.
So, Chair.
Yes, member.
You come back to what Senator Brown has been asking about, a policy decision to determine grade levels, because grade levels are sometimes determined by the scope of responsibility, level of accountability and authority, and also the qualifications that are required for that particular post. Now, what is being sought here by the ministry is one where the labor officer is supposed to perform duties similar to the OSH officer. And even though I do agree with Senator Brown's suggestion that the OSH officer must go deal with maternity leave and the likes, there has to be a distinction, a clear distinction in terms of the scope of responsibility. Because at the end of the day, accountability is a hell of a thing, you know, and when you're accountable for something, it means also that sanctions may be imposed because of you never adhered to the scope of your responsibility and your performance requirement. So we have to be very clear in what our objectives are, and it can be singularly in terms of getting some persons who we have already imposed to do some things.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, member
this conversation started some previous meetings, but I'm still not clear as to the rationale why you want to give the labor officer responsibilities as to that of the OSH officer. I think I like to operate simple, and the labor officer already in the system with a clear mandate. Why not have that clear line of demarcation? Because you have to look at how practical the bill will be when it becomes law to apply. So the labor officer comes to the workplace and sees an issue, safety and health, and starts to deal with that. Tomorrow morning the officer comes and sees the same issue, and both are investigating the same issue within the same ministry. Who has a superior authority in that context? Mm-hmm. And you might be even doing it, and I don't know, because we didn't come together. Mm-hmm. If the rationale seems to be, is it a shortage of human resource? Is that shortage of financial resource to employ the full gamut of the workforce that you need to implement this? Then let us say so. But I don't think we as legislators should so legislate laws with that as the primary objective. If we think it's best to have that separation. Because I can see a lot of confusion at the workplace when both officers seem to cross lines and conflicts develop and inefficiency creeps in, and the worker sometimes get at the back end because we have not gotten the investigation completed because Officer A and Officer B doing the work. So I believe if we're thinking about this bill being revolutionary and to really address safety and health issue, let the OSH officer who have exclusive right to deal with that issue, and the labor officer continues as they are currently mandated, and you shouldn't have a conflict there.
Mr. Chairman, yes. I totally agree. I think it should be left separate. I think it's already understood what the roles and functions are for an OSH officer and the labor officer. Why try to mix or to say if you already have a labor officer there to do the work, possibly of an OSH officer? I think it should be left separate. because I think everybody already knows their roles and function in the workplace.
That's what I don't know. We might suppose let the part officer help with safety too. So everybody in the ministry can deal with everything.
I agree with what Member Flynn said about confusing, but I don't agree with the rest of what she said. It certainly is confusing. Chairman, if you jump to 140.
Yes.
I mean, this is so detailed for the USH officer. Even the issuing of ID cards. And I'm trying to find the equivalent of 140 for the lip.
Yes.
Sorry, Soldier?
No.
Sorry?
And I think that is the exact.
It's not there for the labor officer, which is why I was saying I wanted to reserve some of my comments until we got later in the bill. That is later in the bill, 140.
Yeah,
where you see a number of inconsistencies from my perspective in terms of what one set of officers are to go through compared to the others, in terms of their procedures, how they enter the workplace, how they carry out their mandate. There are big differences.
Yes,
I
Mrs. Seeley Brown.
I also noticed, Chair, when you look at 116A, it speaks to giving the labor officer the power to inquire into a suspected contravention. And then when we look at 141E, we have the USH officer actually investigating contravention. So it's not clear where, one power stops and, yes.
Just imagine now, I am a person conducting business, and the labor officer comes in. And when you look at 117, inspect any work system, consult with the relevant workers, consult with the relevant persons conducting the business undertaking, require the relevant person conducting the business or undertaking to allow the labor officer to inspect, and go look at records. Now, after you start all of that, me no want to see the USH officer again, Yes, I don't want to see the USH officer again. Chairman, bear with me. I can understand 116A. If a labor officer so happen to enter a workplace and he or she views that breach or non-compliance thereof, then report it to the USH officer, the man. But when he or she starts this detailed work and take on this authority on themselves, now if there's a challenge of any nature, or if the inspector have to come in, it appears a little bit confusing.
Well, before you come in, Member Gill, you have touched on a point that while being present at the place of work, if the labor officer sees an occupational safety and health contravention, then that labor officer would then revert to the USH officer. But my understanding is that is exactly what this part is seeking to do.
Yes, Sir, Chairman,
Yes.
Chairman, I've been listening very carefully to the discussion, and as an employer, I'm thinking when we try and operationalize what we have been discussing, it will be mass confusion in the workplace. And I think that needs to be a clear line between the USH officer and the labor officer, or else it's going to be, this is going to be very unproductive.
Well, I think the ministry, and I'm going to ask them now to just explain what will obtain or what is contemplated in respect of the role of an USH officer versus that of a labor officer.
And just reinforce the rationale, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I don't think we are clear on that.
Yes, Sergeant. Yes.
Just before that, is the Labor Officers Powers Act still in force? Okay.
Yes, the act is in force, so it gives the power to enter premises, covered in the schedule.
Okay.
And
right. So what is in 116A of the bill is basically what is in the Labor Officers Powers Act. The Labor Officers Powers Act says that the labor officer, so it says who the labor officer is, who is any public officer authorized in writing by the minister to exercise powers conferred under that act. And then it says the labor officer may at all reasonable times enter upon any premises. It's only that it exempts the dwelling house for the purpose of carrying out any inspection or inquiry which he may consider desirable for ensuring the proper observance of any enactment, which is basically what you have in 116A. I'm really wondering, in light of then what you have is, it has a schedule which lists all the acts in which the labor officer can then, which are the applicable acts. So my question would be, why not just amend the schedule and add the OSH? And if you do that, why would you then need to speak about the labor officers in this manner, which to me now creates some amount of inconsistency when we look at what we're setting out for the OSH officer. So that's why I kind of wanted this intervention just before you go to the ministry, because maybe it could help to guide their response.
Ministry?
Yes, and there is supposed to be a consequential amendment where the OSH Act is supposed to replace the Factories Act in this bill here. But what happened is that we have had a two-pronged approach, because if you look at the Minimum Wage Act, you will see, although the labor officers has this general power to entry, some more powers are fleshed out, for example, in some of the legislation like the Minimum Wage Act. So I think that is the approach we were trying to take, but they would still have the power if it is that to enter, if it is that we stuck with the amendment to the Labor Officers Powers Act and add it to the schedule with the rest. Because I'm saying they would be in the workplace anyway to comply with labor laws. So we're trying to use a resource that is also there to be able to support, and we would expect coordination and cooperation between the officers, seeing that they would fall within the same ministry. Because right now, at this point, we have, under the Factories Act, you have the labor officers' power and the schedule, but you have inspectors under the Factories Act who also have a mandate, the main mandate in relation to it.
This act doesn't address the inspectors, does it?
We're replacing the inspectors with the OSH officers.
All right. So,
Yes.
To me, it
Sergeant.
raises another issue, because if I'm an employer and a labor officer comes in to my business place, I would be asking under what authority. So if because you see, you keep saying that the labor officers have all these other powers as well, and they can enter, and then we're now speaking of them in a very specific way here. If I'm the employer, I'm going to ask the labor officer at the door, why are you entering, under what law, what authority are you using when you enter? That can lead to an issue, because if the powers are not consistent, which is why we always just love this thing about consistency. If the powers are not consistent and you say you're operating under one law and you do something else, it creates a problem. In terms of, from a legal perspective, it can create a liability. So again, just to reinforce the point I made earlier about there being a consistency in terms of approach, ensuring that persons, you don't want your officers also to be confused about which power they can exercise under what law.
In other words, you're saying to me then, what you really come here for? So you come for a particular reason, let's say, again, maternity, or vacation, something under the, or, you know, but then you start talking about occupational safety and health. So under what authority? And again, I say there has to be a clear distinction. I personally wouldn't mix them up. I wouldn't mix them up. And what would have been contemplated in the first instance, even before we got here to our legislation, is to allow a specific officer to deal with occupational safety and health. That's what was being contemplated in our minds long before this came. I understand what the ministry is attempting to do, but I can see where later on, Chair, it is going to cause some confusion and it's going to be cumbersome and costly. Because I can see my good friend over there started to
Chairman.
Yes.
What is clear here, and my sense of it is that the government, and government in the broadest generic sense, is faced with insufficient OSH officers. So they want to supplement the OSH officer work with the labor officer. But already in the Factories Act, the labor officers are allowed to deal with this element as it is now. We're going to be more specific in the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And we have this specialized set of people who require certain degrees, who require approval from GG, maybe I'm overstating that, who really are the prima donnas in this area. And the labor officers are to help them. But if the labor officers are to implement the OSH by amending the labor officers' power, then they need to be up to be as effective as the OSH officers. So what we're trying to do is the hybrid here, while keeping the OSH officers pure, degreed, etc., etc. And I think it's going to create problems. In other words, the labor officers goes into the workplace and is under, quote unquote, underqualified relative to the OSH officer. In other words, a very junior doctor comes in as against a senior consultant. And it depends on which patient. The poor patient may get the resident, the doctor who just come out, and the senior thing. So it's about resources in a sense, and I don't think we should solve it by expediency.
Members, what do you make of the explanation, though, that has been provided by the ministry to say that what is contemplated here is to flesh out the powers of the labor officers, as would have been the case in other legislation? Is it that we are saying that a consequential amendment of the Labor Officers Powers Act would be sufficient and the detail that is contemplated here would no longer be necessary?
I understand the chairman to be saying, in response to the Solgen point, and in respect to my friend Senator Gill's position, that the labor officers really ought to be referring to the consultant, who is the OSH officer. That's why I'm reading it. In other words, when you go into a workplace doing the other things, and you run up into what is the old Factories Act, you have to go to the OSH officer, and they will take it from there. That's why I'm reading it. And if that is the intent, let's say it. Let's say it.
Chair,
Yes,
if you make the
Barbara,
consequential amendment to the Labor Powers Act, labor officers, what you're doing is transferring the duties, and just taking it out of this. The confusion is going to be same way. It's applicable same way. So they'll move the job description and assign it to a particular area under the guise that it is being removed from here. What we are trying to do is trying to ensure that there is no conflicting overlap in terms of the scope of responsibility. That is so clearly defined. Because again, you're going to come to the question of grade levels and what is the rate that is going to be applied to these persons. And so whoever is the representative of these workers is going to have challenge, and the employer going to have challenge too. So let's make let's create the distinction.
May I just ask for,
Yes,
for
members.
knowledge here? Briefly, what currently exists in terms of the role of a liaison officer, labor officer, and the inspector under the current Factories Act? How would both of them work together?
Come on.
Yeah, me know, but
All right, the Factories Act has limitations as we are aware of. It's industrial establishment, factories, construction sites, docks, and ships. So when the labor officer gets a complaint, and it is a safety and health matter in these areas, then it is normally referred to the factory inspectors, and then they would go and do the investigation. That is what obtains now.
so what's the weakness in that? Why you want to give the labor officer a broader scope?
What has happened? It is a mix of a number of things. The ILO, International Labour Organization, there has been a move to try and consolidate in some respects inspections on different matters that touch and concern workers in a workplace. So there's a move to ensure that you have what we call generalized inspectors. So if you have the same situation that Member Gill spoke about, if you have more than one person coming into the workplace, it would be good to have these officers being able to do some assessment at the general level. For example, if it is a labor officer, they can look at safety and health issues, and then if it requires the expertise of the expert, which would be the officer who has been designated a core responsibility. For example, the factory inspector or the safety and health inspector, then that would now be escalated to the factory inspector to resolve that particular matter. So there is a kind of coordination and cooperative relationship between the inspectorate of labor officers and OSH officers, other officers who touch on concern enforcing labor laws.
Yes.
Just clarify for me. The inspectors under the Factories Act, play the role as the OSH officer will play.
Yes, they do.
So that the current relationship is labor officer goes in, sees a problem, and then make the reference to the inspector.
Yes.
So we're now trying in this bill to give the labor officer more than the referral power. Is that what we're trying to do?
Yes, but somewhat limited, and this is why we were saying that the provisional improvement notice that we would have been looking back at, or we would have reverted to the committee, was a means through which, once we have, as I said before, we have been training labor officers, they have been doing the essentials in occupational safety and health, and have been doing that and getting the certification, they will be able to do some level of hazard identification and evaluation and risk assessment to determine that this is a matter that is in the workplace that requires the expertise of the OSH officer. So they would be the ones who would issue this type of notice, and this notice is really giving the PCBU the formal, bring it to them formally that there's an issue in the workplace, and then that is where now behind the scenes the labor officer and the OSH officer would be having that type of communication to ensure that that issue is resolved in the workplace.
Let me ask again, Chair. Is the problem with the current relationship in the Factories Act that the labor officers are not able to identify risk and so forth, so you want to train them up to identify risk? Is that what?
Well, in terms of what was set out and contemplated in the bill, it is really to bring them up to that basic level. Well, that's why I would say the essentials, because they would not, based on their core responsibilities now, have the expertise, the experience, and even the qualification to really function comprehensively and holistically as how ASH officer or inspector, as we know them under the Factories Act, would have functioned. So it is really to solve, in our estimation, the issues of you have many officers going into the workplace to look at different matters. But where you can have that issue resolved, because you can go in the workplace and you see something minor that could be addressed by the PCBU, and the labor officer is so competent based on the training and certification that we would have given them that they can have that impact in the workplace. But where it is not resolved, or where it is complex based on their assessment and it would require the expertise of the ASH officer, then that coordination and cooperation, what would be happening administratively, would kick in and result in the ASH officer coming in to resolve this issue.
That's true. As I said before, my preference is to have that clear line of separation. But as I hear the rationale, why you don't just merge everybody as one unit and train everybody to deal with all the issues, to deal with labor-related matters and safety? Because you're going to train the labor officer to deal with the issues that the ASH officer ought to deal with. So if he or she goes in and sees a safety issue, the competence will be there. The flip side would be, as an ASH officer, suppose I see an issue that a labor officer could deal with. Do I turn a blind eye? So why just don't combine both? I believe it should separate, but as I hear you, as an issue of human resource, shortage, quote unquote, then why just don't train everybody to that competent level so they can deal with the issues? Because you're giving one set of persons the authority to deal with another layer. But then at another layer, the person, you talk about qualification and so you can revamp the thing and open the thing for the all human the country to apply with the necessary skill set and qualification. So the qualification can be a barrier. But as I hear you talk more and more, if we have this as is, you employers and employees and ministry officials will be a tug and war for this to be effective. And if a bill, when it becomes law, is not practical and you don't apply it, it equals zero.
Yes,
Ministry to explain something to me then. Because we go back to clause 90, which speaks to the provisional improvement notice,
yes,
and the labor officer's powers to issue these notices. However, in clause 141, you have, and these notices are issued in relation to contraventions.
yes.
However, in clause 141E, we see here that the OSH officer has also the power to investigate contraventions. So I'm just wondering at what point in time will this provision kick in if the labor officer has all these powers on the line to issue contraventions and remedy contraventions, and just at what point? Yeah.
When I looked at from where the role of the labor officer, and it goes into 121, and then you look at 149, it seems to me that there is some duplication. And as been said, where do I start as the OSH officer? Do I go back over retrieving document, accessing information, the same information that would have been gathered? Remember now, one of the primary objectives is to minimize the risk and exposure within a defined specific period. So when we start having this duplication of efforts, nothing gets done. And we delay it. Maybe for this, because this is really where the rubber hits the road. And this is where we have to get it clear and as precise as possible and not seek to substitute the human capital in terms of having persons exercise responsibility because you don't have enough. And we know under the present dispensation there aren't enough labor inspectors and there aren't enough labor officers either. And I'm about creating jobs, you know. I'm about creating more employment once it's necessary. But I'm not about creating duplication of efforts and then people start complaining that the thing is confusing and that we would have passed a piece of legislation that is cumbersome, conflicting, and confusing.
So can we then just... I think we've exhausted.
Yeah. No.
Going over this, can we then possibly then ask the minister to go back and just listening to everything that was said to see how to actually...
Yes, Member Flynn, but why the discussion is important, and I think Member Skeffrey has touched on the point, an understanding of what currently obtains is important in going forward. And my understanding of what the ministry is saying is that the labor officers who ordinarily will operate within the place of work, should they turn up at a certain workplace and they recognize a contravention of the OSH, the Occupational Safety Act, then they have limited powers. And thereafter, it is the OSH officer who is going to be brought into the picture.
Chairman, in that, go ahead, Julie.
Yes.
What is clear to me is that 116 to 131 need to be guided by that policy assumption that they are to make a reference. And that is what we want of the labor officers. I hear, however, from the technical people that they want more than that from the labor officers. So that needs to be clarified in terms of policy. Is it the referral or is it the more than the referral? And that's what I think clauses 116 to 131 has to decide. They have to decide on where is this going to be fish or is it going to be fish and fowl? So we need to make up our mind on that. And if we do that, it will help the committee to come to a better understanding. That would be my approach. And I agree with Member Flynn. Go back and think out what you want, because there are going to be problems. There are going to be problems. And are we, and another way of putting it, Chairman, are we willing to take the Factories Act off the schedule that the labor officers deal with? Because essentially that's what we would be doing if we, that's another approach to it, to say labor officers, apart from identifying and referring, you don't have to deal with the problems. Because right now, under the Factories Act, we have labor officer and inspectors. So it is the inspectors who deal with the safety issues. So I would simply say, identify, if they go into a workplace and identify these issues, they refer to the OSH officers. And if practically you want to train the labor officers to become neo-OSH officers or baby OSH officers, that's a policy decision you can do and then get them up to the necessary qualification. Because let me tell you my biggest fear. This bill is drafted and it's been sponsored in a large way by OSH officers. And I fear carve-outs. Might be thinking, huh? Oh? You have to know. You see these things every day, man. You read body language, you read the signs. In other words, this ASH officers are making sure that they upgrade the Factories Act and insert themselves. So much so that the ASH director is not appointed by Services Commission and maybe is coming from the GG. So these are ASH officers dominated legislation that has given them the desired and deserved, let me add, deserved recognition, right? Deserved recognition and desired recognition. And that's what we have to look at, and so as parliamentarians, we have to make sure that we cover the interests of everybody, not just the sponsors of the legislation. That's why I'm seeing it, and it gives me some problem there.
Yes. All right, I've heard you, Member Brown. Members, Ministry, I've heard the committee. So let us now hear from you in terms of how you intend to deal with Part 7.
Well, Chair, just to answer some of the questions that were posed, the question that was posed by Member Skeffrey in terms of the having one set of officers that would be able to do everything. It is just the same as though in academia you have different domains. You have social sciences, you have law, you have natural sciences, you have computer sciences. It's a bit difficult at times to get one person who has been trained and have attained that threshold to be able to function in all different areas. I mean, as an inspector or an ASH officer, you are carrying out the functions as contemplated by the legislation, but you are not necessarily a counselor or a lawyer. So it would be a bit of a challenge to get someone who has been trained in the different disciplines to be able to function in all areas. So that was one of the reasons why the division between the ASH officer and the labor officers when it comes down to certain matters. The intent was to try to be efficient in the utilization of the labor and ASH officers in the ministry. So the thinking was to have the labor officers at least training the basics of safety and health to be able to impact the workplace when they are there as labor officers. In relation to Ms. Seeley Brown's question about the PIN, the Provisional Improvement Notice, labor officers normally receive complaints, and the department that receives it is the pay and conditions of employment. And we say conditions of employment, which could mean the conditions in the workplace. So if there's an issue in the workplace that is safety and health related, you at least want to have them get that training that they can go in. So that ILO training we spoke about and certification was a means to bring them up to that level of competence, not necessarily competence of someone who has completed a degree and the prerequisites to become an officer, but enough for them to function when they are dealing with complaints that come to the ministry. So that was the intent behind that. And then that also would now flow into what Member Gale was saying about in terms of the duplication. It wasn't really looked at as duplication. It was really looking at complementing the services, because the reason why we are looking at this regulation in this manner is to ensure that we have some level of self-regulation, because it is always problematic to get all the resources that you may need in your area, but it's a matter of trying to look around and see where there is existing resources and trying to leverage them in a manner that can help to complement your operations.
All right.
Before we
Yes.
move, probably see if Mrs. Celia Brown could help us. Do we have any experience from the other Caribbean countries who have implemented this legislation as to how they treat this labor officer, or is it that they have more resources?
I'm afraid no, I have not.
Yeah.
I've not seen
Well,
it.
the ministry, I don't know if you have looked at, Member Brown has asked a question in terms of what obtains elsewhere, whether we have seen a similar model whereby you have labor officers and OSH officers in this way.
Well, Grenada, I know is one country that, based on the small size, that you may have a limited amount of officers, so you will have labor officers functioning somewhat like OSH officers. But with Jamaica and the size and the number of places that would require coverage, that mix may not be as easy to have.
Hearing Chairman that we're unique.
I thought you knew that.
I was trying to understand so that I might make up my mind. In other words, Belize small and less population. Trinidad have a lot of money, so they may be able to, and more industry, but they may be able to employ more, and so they don't need to merge their labor officers. So that we are being drawn into doing something that is unique to Jamaica. Nothing wrong with that, because there's no one size fit all. But I need to be convinced that this is the best route for our country and to avoid the conflicts and tension that could come from a bill like this, where we need everybody to be buying into. And as I say, one argument by an employer which says, this is just more problem, kill our ability to get it accepted. And that's what I want to avoid.
Through you, Chair.
Yes.
Do you have any idea of how many OSH officers we intend to resource the structure with? Any idea at all?
What would be the ideal?
That's very good.
We would have to do a thorough assessment, but right now we have basically 16, including the director.
Inspectors.
OSH officers are inspectors. And our jurisdiction, we are responsible for about over 3,000 factories. Construction sites, we try to do as much as we can. Every quarter we do probably around 500 or so.
With 16 officers?
Yes. So with this new legislation and covering all workplaces, it will be greatly expanding, as you know, that the service sector, the public sector as well, there's more workers, more premises to investigate into complaints of safety and health and to monitor and enforce the regulation. So it is, when you think about the whole situation when it comes on to the size of the public service sector, 9% of GDP, all of those, you try to look around and see how much you can rationalize and use your resources as efficiently as possible.
No, I understand where you're going. So in other words, what we're saying is that we need to train the labor officers to a certain standard that they can deal with some safety issues. Because the 16 officers that you speak of definitely can't cover the numbers that you spoke about.
Yeah, that's it.
Right, but we need to simplify it, because as an employer, I said to you, I feel a little confused, in terms of thinking of one of my factories and what will happen there. It kind of feels a little confusing. So I'm not sure we're going to do that legislatively. But as AG said, the 140, I'm anxious to reach to that clause.
Quickly though, what is the scope for training in this area? We have 16 now.
Yes.
You're going to train the labor officer, but if other person want to get into this field, already is such training available?
Yes,
And That's quick. That's what public knowledge.
There is. Mr. Mahan can respond to it. Yes. The question relates to opportunities for training and
so as not to see it as an elitist club.
Yes.
Could you repeat?
Training. So no, you talk about 16 inspectors, and we're going to USH officers. Obviously, you want more in the bill. So I'm asking, what was the scope for training this area for persons who have interest in this particular area?
There are a lot of opportunities available. In terms of external recruitment, we have the University of the West Indies who have their Environmental, Occupational Safety and Health program. You also have a similar program that is offered by UTech. And every year there are, well, at the University of the West Indies, I know that roughly 16 to 20 persons graduate from the University of the West Indies. There's also a master's program that's offered by the
That's
university.
readily available then?
Yes.
Final question. You have 16 now. What's the establishment?
That's on the establishment, 16.
So you have 16 employed now, but the establishment is the number that you may employ.
16.
16. So you're at maximum? 16? No, I don't mean what you need for this new bill, but currently, as inspectors, you are 16 and that's the maximum you are allowed to employ?
Yes, the maximum we are allowed to employ is the 16.
Okay.
We actually just recently had 2 persons who were transferred to another ministry. One of them, we lost them to mines and geology. But we are in the process of trying to fill those 2.
But obviously when this bill becomes law, the minister naturally has to increase the establishment.
Yes.
Naturally.
Right.
Significantly, yeah.
In other words, so in the contemplation of that, is there a desired cadre that is required to effectively carry out the mandate of this bill? That's the first question. The second thing I want you to contemplate, and it comes back again to grade levels. So, you have these under your proposition. You have the labor officers who right now I assume is at a particular level. And your OSH officers have this designation to which there are certain qualifications that are going to be attached to them that may be over and above the role of labor officers. But you don't want to find yourself in a situation where colleagues, you don't want to find yourself in a situation where a labor officer, because you have given them these responsibilities, they can't transition to being an OSH officer because an OSH officer is at a different level or a higher level. So you have to determine career path within your own ministry. And that is why I come back to the question that Member Brown asked about what is the grade level.
Chairman,
I'll hear Member Campbell before you come in, Mrs. Brown. Yes. Oh, you're smart.
But Chair, I'm thinking
yes.
it's not that the labor officers are assisting because their functions are different. So that's the problem I have with the question had to respond to the question that was asked by you. Remember when they did not assist in the OSH officers, the functions are totally different. So I'm thinking, why don't you then, if you see that you have this scarcity of OSH officers, deem the labor officers to be OSH officers for the purposes of this act, and then you have one set of functions and one set of powers for these labor officers who you would train, you say you're going to train to operate at the level of OSH officers for the purposes of this act, rather than have them having separate functions from the OSH officers.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Member Campbell, use your mic. I recognize you.
I'm sorry, Chairman. That's the point I was getting to. Let's have the deeming provision when they're acting, which would more often than not, they would be not acting as officers. They
That
would
is
be
so.
taking in. So when they do act as USH officers, then you deem it so. And so that you wouldn't have a liability issue arising from it, because that is where I have the fear that if they extend themselves and get into that realm, into that place where they're doing the work of carrying out the duties of USH officers, a whole series of things flow from that. So the act could, when they're so doing, for that limited space, deem them and give them the power so that we wouldn't have the liability issues flowing from that. So I think this is it.
Very well. CTD, Gardner, yes.
Thank you, Chairman. Where the ministry was contemplating going with this is exactly what the ILO is proposing, that we have a joint inspectorate. A joint inspectorate. So you have persons or labor officers, if you want to include the USH officers, everybody have this base similar training, which takes them to a certain level. And then you have the specialist area. So USH, you would have employment agencies, you would have those in PCEB who would be specialists in their own area. So when a labor officer goes into an establishment, they have some basic competencies to identify certain issues and to address those issues. But I take the point that how it is probably written is not making clear enough distinctions in terms of how that would work. And this is where, and in the context of Jamaica with the scarce resources, it is important for us to also bear that in mind. Member Campbell, in terms of having the USH officers being designated as labor officers, etc. Remember, we're talking about different expertise areas, right? Different skills, different competencies are necessary. So you would not be able to just say, okay, and somebody with a social science background should be an USH officer or vice versa. But we can agree that both the person with the scientific background and the social science background can have some basic competence, and we can use that as a basis for going forward.
Chairman, I know this has been a long discussion, but this issue of a joint inspectorate sounds to me, and you said that's where the ILO wants us to go.
Yes.
It sounds to me that's the direction that we should be heading in terms of efficiency, productivity, and clarity. But what I'm reading here is not reflecting that. Or if it is, I'm confused. You know, I think that's the direction that we should be legislating in terms of a joint inspectorate, and you have specialists above that can deal with specific issues. That sounds like the practical thing, or practical direction which we should be heading in. It sounds like best practice to me.
Yeah, which is why, again,
Yes.
I propose a rethink by the policymakers and look at it. I am one who argues for outcome-oriented approach to life. So when Senator Webby asked the question, how many inspections you're likely to have to do, we got 3,000 plus. Am I correct? 3,000 plus.
Yes.
Currently, yes.
All right, good. So we're looking at 16 USH officers, which is the establishment. And I know to change that establishment, you're going to have to go through Ministry of Finance, etc., etc. So 10 years' time before this legislation get really effective. But just doing a quick back of the bill calculation, with 16 into 3,000, that's 187 inspections per officer per year in a 260 full work days here. I don't take in sick leave, I don't take in vacation leave, I don't take in training, and I don't take in the fact that one investigation may require more than 1 day, member clerk. So, practically, we're setting up something. Thankfully, we're no longer going to imprison or fine in the courts. Oh, I didn't add that. Ash officer may have to go to court, sir, if we add that in. So that the time the ash officer will have is going to be limited, and so a lot of inspections won't take place. And that is what you have to work through. How do we maximize? How do we get the best productivity outcome, as Senator Webber said? And that's why I would say take the weekend or whatever and look to see how we fit that, and search other jurisdictions to see if they are to grapple with this problem. I'm sure we have connection into Belize, Guyana, Trinidad, where people have passed this and asked how they dealt with that. Because New South Wales and New Zealand have a whole heap of human capital that allow them to treat it a certain way that we won't be able to. And that's something I think you have to work through, because in the end, this is about the little businessman and the big businessman working through. And Senator Skeffrey's question about the training of these people, I share with you a little secret. A businessman once told me that as fast as you train them, they're not coming to you. As fast as they're trained, they're not coming to you. Quality controlling companies that can pay more.
That's a fact.
That can pay more. So we're going to impose a regime that we won't be able to manage. So don't set up ourselves, is what I'm asking you to do.
So, Chairman,
Yes.
so this, I just want to pursue this for one more minute.
Yes.
In terms of the joint inspectorate, is it something that the ministry as a policy is willing to look at?
Certainly. I mean, the contemplation, as I understand it, is that, I mean, there is a joint inspectorate, and the powers of the labor officer would be limited, and thereafter, their duty would be to engage the USH officers. And that is why Mr. Mahon would have mentioned the provisional improvement notice, because their duty would extend up to the issuance of a provisional improvement notice. And as it says, a provisional improvement notice, which means that something would happen thereafter, and that is where the USH officer would come in and discharge his duties. Well, yes.
I'm just reminding the
Yes.
committee that we had looked at the provisional improvement notice, and you had sent us back to do some work in relation to it that we're currently doing in relation to work. So in relation to the labor officer issuing that provisional improvement notice, and if it's not addressed, then the USH officer would come in from there, because it could be that the situation is rectified without the USH officer having to come in. So that is the other work that we're doing to support this, that we would be reporting back to the committee about. Because there are many other notices, by the way, which the USH officer alone can issue. Prohibition, non-disturbance. So they do have more of a wider enforcement mechanism than the labor officers, whose job would have stopped at the pin. But we will look back to see, because we're trying to fix the pin to come back to the committee in terms of what the guidance you gave to us the last time.
Just so that the ministry understands what is expected of it. There was a divergence because some members were in support of the joint inspectorate, while other members apparently you were saying the function should be separate and distinct. What the ministry has indicated is that in keeping with the International Labour Organization's requirements and best practice, the joint inspectorate is a preferred approach. I don't know if Member Skeffrey and, Member Cuthbert, she's not here, but I know you had expressed a particular view on keeping the function separate And apart, I don't know if having heard from the ministry, if you still maintain, just for clarity, so that there's an understanding by the staff of the ministry as to what is expected.
Well, I respect the technical expertise, so I await the recommendation that will come, and once it fits within the broad policy and is practical, then so I'm not hard and fast, but my interest is that whatever we pass into law, we can apply it, and it makes a difference that we want it to make.
Let me state for the record that I was one who had a preference for a clear distinction of the levels of responsibility. And I was never one who would have been sold on an idea of a template from elsewhere without looking at our realities. So the ILO might prescribe something, but it doesn't mean that it would necessarily work in our situation, given the volume of expectation and mandate and objective of this piece of legislation. Against the background, when we have a small cadre of operatives, and there is no suggestion from the ministry that that is going to be expanded to the desire of creating the effect that is required. So I'm not sold on an idea because the ILO said so, that we must hug it up and run with it. And so I'd want the ministry to, in their own deliberation, consider the best possible route that can satisfy the needs at this time. Again, I go back to this thing that came from New South Wales, that they might be having labor officers and occupational safety health inspectors in the numbers that we have in our Jamaica. They might have it in each state or province. So we have to deal with the realities. This is where the rubber is going to hit the road in terms of the functional components. We can put legislation in place, companies can put policies in place, but if you don't have the manpower resources to effectively carry it out, it's not going to work.
Very well. Ministry?
I just want to clarify that it's not something that we copied from the New South Wales, in that they did not have the labor officers, because obviously they have the personnel to have their USH officers doing the work. So we were trying to look at our situation to see that we may need additional help for the USH officer.
All right, with that said, in respect of part 7, then the ministry will revert to the committee, having heard from the committee members as to the direction you would rather see. Part 7, yes. Well, unless you are of a different view. I mean, we were at 116, but part 7 goes up to 130. So it speaks to, yes, 131, that speaks to the labor officers. So I believe comprehensively the entire part. In respect of part 8, I know there is a further consideration, policy consideration. So, yes, we would not be able to move on to part 8 today. Yes. So, what I will ask for, members, is it's now 3:30, for us to have the adjournment now. Yes, you are coming prepared to work. Yes. We meet next on Monday of next week. I think we will pick up at part 7. Going back to part 7, because part 7, as you recognize, it impacts part 9. Ministry, I do not know if you have any intervention here. Yes.
We would like the opportunity to go and map out what we have in mind for the labor officers and to fix that, plus what we have in mind for the provisional improvement notice, and come back to the committee with that.
So in respect of Mondays, and it's just to be clear as to where we will pick up on Monday. Do we pick up at part 9?
Something for me with Monday, sir. When is standing finance? Yeah, is the following week?
Yes.
Okay.
No, this is very important.
We need to go back to part 7 because it's going to affect some of the other clauses.
Yes.
Because in relation to the OSH officers' functions, if you want to be clear about, we have to be clear about the labor officers' functions, solve that, and then move on to the OSH officer. So I would recommend that we go ahead, that we fix this part 7, and then we proceed from there.
So we resume with part 7 on Monday of, well, the ministry is going to take a look, relook at part 7. Yes. I gather it's for a joint inspectorate in relation. Well, members, the clerk is seeking to have an appreciation as to the guidance that the committee is giving to the ministry. Yes. So, for the record, member, you could, my understanding is that it was a joint inspectorate. But I figure Member Gale made a submission that the ministry has to examine a scheme that fits within the Jamaican reality.
Chair, whilst I have expressed my concern, I am not inflexible. If the ministry would come back with a position that I would find attractive and workable. The first thing for me is that the ministry has indicated a willingness to conduct a review and not being transigent in their approach. So that for me, I'm willing to examine in a detailed way what they are willing to put forward on Monday.
Sorry, Chairman.
Yes.
I mean, it sounds to me that there could be a lot of work involved and a lot of the thought process from to get this workable. And I'm just asking this as a question.
Yes.
Do you have enough time to do that by Monday? Because you don't want to bring it half-baked and we spend 2 hours having a discussion around nothing.
Yes.
Can we ask for until Thursday based on that?
Yes. Well, you have heard from the ministry. They are asking until Thursday, which is 1 week to revert to us. Ministry, you will have to advise the committee then, because your advice is that we do not move forward until you have resolved part 7 because it impacts part 8 and 9. Do we need to schedule a meeting for Monday of next week? And I ask that because I know that the committee would have given you instruction to go back and look at certain aspects of the bill. Will we be in a position to update the committee on some of those works on Monday? If not, there's no need for a meeting on Monday.
Chairman, may I just inquire as to
Yes.
whether is it only a desire that we go after what the ILO is saying, or we have an obligation there's a treaty obligation?
Mrs. Bennett Campbell?
No, I'm not.
Mm-hmm. Or Sergeant?
Well, I was going to ask if the ministry could actually just send to us the specific ILO convention that is being referred to, because sometimes language makes a difference. I mean, when you talk about levels of supervision, it doesn't necessarily have to mean you have to have separate named entities. So I would like to we would want to review it. I think the legal team would want to review what is being said so that we can just have a better appreciation then of the situation. And I just wanted to say, Chair, from the
Yes.
AGC's perspective, so we had sent our comments up to Part 7, the
Yes.
Ministry. But we're also aware of some potential changes that you may have for Part 8.
Part 8, yes.
And so we haven't sent comments on Part 8.
Mhm.
We're going to have a challenge sending comments on Part 9 because it depends on what the functions of the labor officer will be to go into the functions of the OSH officer. So, I mean, we have marked up, we have our own set of comments, but it's not something that we really wish to circulate right now because it could just be more confusing until we get a better idea of the direction in which the ministry is going, and then we would determine. And then we don't want to circulate our comments until we have a clearer idea of the policy in terms of the parts 8, 9.
Very well.
Just to say though, Chair, that Mr. Aldred, what you have indicated, the ILO is not, I don't believe it's a convention, I believe it's a recommendation. And you know, we don't have to really accept a recommendation.
Member,
Let me just.
Brown.
This is supposed to be one government. And so I hope that the legal team and the ministry people would get together and come with a government position led by the Ministry of Labor Policy people, a position so that we don't get that, well, Labor come with this, the legal people feel this way. Would love for the committee to get the product of that deliberation between the legal teams, and we benefited from that earlier.
I believe we continue to benefit.
Yeah, so
We continue to benefit. We were trying to finalize whether or not we should schedule, yes, meeting for Monday, ministry. Yeah. Well, we already have a meeting scheduled where we're seeking to ascertain whether we should keep the schedule or vacate our. All right, so members, we will meet on Thursday, next week Thursday at 10. At 10 a.m. and we should be having an extended sitting. Yes. Sergeant? Oh, I'm told data protection is at 2, so we can't go beyond. Perhaps 12:31.
12:30 because some of us also do data protection.
Yes.
Just a request.
We will bear that in mind, certainly.
Yes. But so it is one government. It is one government. And we don't intend to convey that it is anything other than
Member
one
Brown knows
government.
that, Sergeant.
The only issue is, no, I have to also clarify it for the record from our perspective at the Attorney General's chambers. But it's just that there are times, depending on the timing, if we don't get the comments and we sometimes are late in sending comments in, so we don't have enough time, and because of the speed within which the committee is now moving, there is not enough time for a lot of collaboration behind the scenes. But that being said, it would be, I'm hoping that the ministry will be able to somehow magically work very quickly to be able to send us something that we would be able to start reviewing even ahead of the committee meeting, so that at least we could also start putting our thoughts together.
Very well. Yes. Ministry has taken note of that. Yes.
I'm happy the Sergeant has affirm and reaffirm
Your
the
suspicions.
one government.
Yes.
And so all we want is to make sure that the one government is as productive as they can and have shown to be in the past. That's all we want as a public.
Oh, bro. All right. The It's now 20 minutes to 4, members. May we have an adjournment?
So move.
Yes, so this meeting is adjourned until Thursday, February 20th at 10 a.m.